Alright, so I'm going to walk through the first couple of steps on this gridded portrait. Actually, I'm going to walk through the whole thing eventually, but we're going to start with the first couple. So the first thing we need to do is select the photograph. So this is probably going to happen on your computer. You can pick a photo you take or a friend takes or just find one on the internet. And talk about all that in the assignment. But once you have your photo, I'm going to make sure it's cropped to the right size and maybe do some adjustments on brightness and contrast and print it out for you. For our photos, we want to have a good range of value, so we want to have really light values in there, but we also want it to get dark, preferably on the face. It'll just make it easier to give some form and to get all the values in. The closer the values are together, the kind of trickier it gets to get all the values in. So it's good to have a good range of value in the picture. So the next thing we're going to do is make an 8 by 10 grid on a piece of tracing paper. So I'm going to give you some tracing paper like this, and you're going to make a 1 inch by 1 inch grid going 8 squares across and 10 squares down. So that's going to make an 8 inch by 10 inch area, but your paper is a little bigger than that, so you have to have a margin. So if we measure this paper, we can quickly find out that it's 12 by 9. So to figure out how big the margin is going to be, we take the size of the paper, so 9, minus the size of the grid, minus 8, that equals 1, and then we divide it in 2. So we have a ½ inch margin on each side. And then the same thing, going up and down, we've got 12 inches, minus the 10 we're using for the grid, leaves us with 2. Divide that by 2, we've got 1 inch on the bottom, 1 inch on the top. So depending on the size of the tracing paper, you might have different size margins. 9 by 12 is pretty standard. I think I also have some 8.5 by 11 tracing paper. So, make sure you know which one you have and adjust the margins accordingly. And then you're going to make the grid. The best way to make the grid is to kind of lay in that margin first, and then go ahead and you want to mark. There's pencil. You want to mark every inch. You actually want to mark these here. And then, instead of trying to draw a straight square line across from your marks, you actually want to go ahead and flip your paper and then mark each 1 inch increment again. And then once you have marks on this side and this side, you're just going to connect them together. And you'll do the same thing on the sides. It's much better to do it that way. I know it seems quicker to just draw straight lines, but they're going to be a little bit off, and if your grid's a little bit off, it gets wonky pretty quick. So you want to kind of do it the long way and the right way, even if it takes a little more time and effort. So after you have that grid laid out, you're going to lay out a similar grid on a piece of newsprint. This is actually too big for me to get into the whole shot, but this grid is going to be twice as big in each dimension. So it's going to be a 2 inch by 2 inch grid. Each square is 2 inches by 2 inches. And the total size of the grid is going to be 16 inches by 20 inches. So the paper, actually did the math right here. The paper is 24 by 18. And our grid is going to be 20 by 16. So if we subtract that, we get 4 inches by 2 inches. So that's our margins. And we divide those by 2. So we have 2 inches on the top. The bottom and the top, and 1 inch on each side. So then you can lay that grid out using a ruler, and you want to do 2 inch increments for this one, and again there should be 8 of them by 10. So you may have noticed my lettering and numbering. That's really useful for helping you find squares on the grid. So when I'm doing my copying, if I see something here, I can go, okay, that's in C3, and then I can go over to my newsprint and do it in C3. All right, after you have both of your sheets done, you're going to take your image and take your your tracing paper. You're going to lay your tracing paper on top of your image. So you might have a little bit of extra printed area, so you want to arrange your grid so that it kind of fits on here properly and you've got a good composition. And then you're going to actually tape the tracing paper to the regular paper. So you can flip it over, hold it in place, stick a little bit of tape up there. And that's just to keep it from moving while you trace. And then you're going to trace the important lines in your image. So let me get out my tracing I've already done. That goes on like that. So the main thing that I want to get here is the shadow areas mapped out. So you can see I've even done some cross hatching where the shadows go. I didn't do the whole background because I don't think that that's really necessary. But for the shadow areas, like in the eyes, on the side of the cheeks, under the hair here, I actually did some hatching to indicate that those were shadows. And you're really mainly focusing on the terminator line or the edge of each shadow. So you want to trace the edge of those shadows so that you know where to put the shadows in later. So we're really trying to think about the shape of the shadows and not really too much about the edges. Now if there are important edges, like on the edge of the nose here, you can get those too. Those will be useful. But don't feel like you need to outline the eye or outline the nose or outline the mouth. Just try to outline the edges of the shadows. And try not to think too much about what parts the shadows are being cast on, but just try to get the basic shapes of the shadows. It's a good idea to think about this like it's almost like a map, where you're just trying to make a map of where the shadows are and where the light areas are. And the more detail you get and the closer you are to accurate on here, the better it's going to be and the easier it'll be once you do your transfer. But it does make the tracing and enlargement process a little bit harder. But I think in the long run, it'll pay off for you to be careful and try to get as much detail as you can in that process. So after that, all we're going to do is enlarge this. So we're going to take this grid here and we're going to enlarge it onto our other grid. Now you're going to be using a 2" by 2" grid, but as you see, that's too big for me to really show you what I'm doing and record at the same time. So I've cheated a little bit and I've actually done a 1.5" by 1.5" grid. So I'm still doing an enlargement, but it's not as big as yours. And I kind of worked box to box and transferred the information from here over to here. So I'm actually going to show you a time lapse of that at this point. There are a few clever tricks you can use during this process. So let's look over here, starting at this fingertip. I gotta map this out. So a handy way to kind of help yourself out is to kind of mark where these lines start and end. So I've got this one. It comes down to about here. So I try to figure out when I'm marking intersections, and then you can draw. It's a little more easier to find that curve. I try to figure out when I try to find those intersections if things are more at halfway point or like 1/3 point or 1/4 point. And then you can kind of mark that. Sometimes it'll be like right near half point or just short. But usually if you can figure out whether it's like at the halfway point, at the 1/4 point, or the 1/3 point, you can get pretty accurate. Or if it's just to the left or just to the right of those. So that can be really handy. Another thing you can do, especially for like angles, if we're trying to figure out the angle of this finger, you can sight the angle with your pencil and then transfer it over to your copy, and that can help you to get the right angle on lines. So that can be really useful as well. Another thing, remember, this one is half the size of your big one, so you can always also use a ruler. So I could measure how far over this line intersects with the grid, and I can see that it's a 1/4 inch. So I move over here and go to a 1/2 inch. It doesn't work with mine because mine's a little bit smaller than yours, but you can do that. You can actually measure how far along the grid every interaction happens and mark it. And another thing that you can see that I did earlier is I took and I flipped my two images. A lot of times people do this, especially when they're doing portraits. And what this does is it kind of takes the image and turns it from being a picture where I can recognize the different parts of the face. I can tell that this is a finger, and this is an eye, and this is a nose. And it helps us to kind of see the image more as abstract shapes. And your brain is generally better at processing and copying those abstract shapes when you don't know what they represent. It's a little trick. It can be really handy sometimes. So if you find yourself thinking too much about what you're drawing and not really processing it as abstract shapes, you might want to flip them over and try it that way. Okay, so now we're going to do our transfer. So what we're doing here is we're trying to get our image that we have on our big grid here onto a clean sheet of drawing paper. So the idea is to get rid of the grid. That's pretty much what the process is all about. So we're going to start this by coloring charcoal on the entirety of the back of our newsprint. And you can use all kinds of soft materials for this. You can use graphite for it. That works. You can use pastel. Anything kind of soft like that that has a tendency to rub off the paper will work great for this. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover the entirety of the background with charcoal. Okay, so now I place my newsprint drawing on top of my clean drawing paper, and I want to get everything squared up and positioned. You might have a margin for yours, so you want to get everything in the right position. You can leave a margin around your final drawing. That's usually a good practice. Mine doesn't fit quite that way. It's kind of taking up the whole width of the paper, so I'm positioning it top to bottom. And after I get that positioned, I'm going to go ahead and trace over my drawing again. And this time I'm going to use a colored pencil. I'm using the colored pencil because it makes it easy to see where I've already traced. If I use a regular pencil, it can be difficult to see which parts of the drawing I've traced and which ones I haven't. So this makes it really easy to see. And then at the end of this, I will pull the paper up and you'll see that the charcoal from the back of the paper there has actually transferred onto my sheet of drawing paper. Okay, so now that I have my drawing transferred, I can start adding the charcoal to make the shadows. So I want to start off by making a two-tone image basically. So I'm going to just shade in all of the shadow areas. I'm going to leave all of the non-shadow areas white. So I'm just going to go in and fill the whole thing with charcoal, except for the lighter areas. And I want to separate the drawing into two values first, and then I'm going to go into the kind of details in each of those areas, and the light areas and the shadow areas. I will adjust my deeper shadows in the next step, and I will also adjust my highlights and halftones in the next step. But for now, I just want to fill in those shadows.
Alright, now that I've got the shadows pretty much mapped in, I can kind of go in there and smooth them out a little bit with a Kleenex or a Tortillion or a Q-tip or something like that. I want to kind of get those shadows flat and smooth, and now I can start adding my highlights and halftones. So I'm largely going to use my Tortillion for this and just kind of push charcoal pigment where I need it to go. What I'm trying to get are those areas that are lighter than the shadow areas, but still a little bit darker than the paper. And I also want to isolate the areas that are the pure white of the paper showing through. And I want to try to keep those areas as clean as I can throughout the drawing, but I can erase them. So I'm going to use my Tortillion to move stuff around. I'm going to use my kneaded eraser to kind of reshape areas. And I'm going to occasionally use my Vine charcoal. And when I'm using my Vine charcoal, I might add a little bit of pigment to a shadow and then move it over using a Tortillion. Or I might do like a little bit of cross hatching, a little bit of light cross hatching to just add a little bit of pigment to a surface and then smooth it out and blend it in with my Tortillion. All right, now that I have mapped out my highlights and midtones, you can see I've got a full range of values, going from about a 4 out of 5 on our value scale, so a medium dark, to about a 1 on our value scale, white paper. Now I'm going to go in with my charcoal pencil. This should be the first time I'm using my charcoal pencil on this drawing. The charcoal pencil is much more difficult to erase. Charcoal pencil will draw darker than the Vine charcoal, so I can use it to get deep values in the shadows. So anywhere the shadow is totally deep and looks like it's pure ink, I'm going to add a little bit of charcoal pencil. I can also use it to get details like I'm doing with the eye here. So I really want to kind of use it carefully and lightly and slowly build up pigment, or use it to really darken in shadows. I have to be careful with my hand here because I'm going to be kind of smudging things if I'm setting it on the paper. You can always put a piece of scrap paper under your hand to help you protect the paper while you're drawing, or you can kind of think about which direction you're working and or work from the upper left down to the lower right if you're right-handed, or the upper right down to the lower left if you're left-handed. So I really just want to get in all the details and the dark areas, and I can make adjustments to my highlights and shadows with my erasers and Tortillon during this process as well. But I'm just trying to get the drawing finished at this point and bring it to the spot where I am done working on it.